Good evening. I'm Nancy Perricchini, the director of the UCLA Principal Leadership Institute. Tonight we are celebrating National Principals Month and welcome all of you on behalf of the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. Thank you so much for joining us for what promises to be a thoughtful and timely conversation. The Principal Leadership Institute was established in 2000 at UCLA and UC Berkeley campuses to recruit and train leaders for justice to work in the most underserved, deserving schools in Los Angeles and the Bay Area. Two of tonight's panel members are graduates of the UCLA Principal Leadership Program. Our discussion will highlight how schools have been hit hard by COVID-19 and how school principals are responding to the multiple and complex needs of their students, teachers, parents, and communities. We are eager to hear about the experiences of these school leaders and their ideas for moving forward in ways that further learning, equity, and racial justice. We are excited to introduce tonight's moderator, Louis Freedberg, the Executive Director of EdSource, a highly respected educational news organization in California. Louis has analyzed and reported on local, state, and national educational policy issues for more than 2 decades. He also spent more than 10 years in the San Francisco Chronicle, where he was an award-winning education reporter. As the preeminent multimedia education platform in California, EdSource serves as a critical resource of education information, research, and analysis for the largest, most diverse public education system in the nation. And we are honored to have Louis and EdSource participate in tonight's discussion. Louis, welcome to the Principal's Office, and we are looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, and welcome to all of you out there to what I know will be a hugely stimulating discussion. During this pandemic, as I'm sure all of you know, there's rightfully been a lot of focus on teachers, parents, and students, but much less on principals, who are key to making schools work. And their jobs have become immeasurably more difficult and important over the last several months and remain crucial to getting us through this crisis. And that's why the survey and the report that John Rogers and Michael Ishimoto did is so important, and why I'm grateful for them for providing the framework for our discussion today. We do want to make this webinar discussion as conversational as possible. And so please, if you have questions, feel free to put it into the Q&A box. You'll see the button on the right-hand side at the bottom of your screen. We have a terrific panel this afternoon, and let me introduce them briefly. Firstly, John Rogers, who is a professor of UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. Many of you know John, who has been doing incredible work on these and other issues for many years. He's director of UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access. We're also really pleased to have Cynthia Gonzalez. She is the principal of the School of Technology and Communications at the Diego Rivera Learning Complex in the LA. Are we getting feedback, by the way? Are we okay? I was getting a little feedback here, so we'll continue on. Juan Manuel Raigosa is principal of Berkeley High School and was a recently appointed principal. I know that because both of my kids went there, and one just graduated last spring, which, as you know, graduation didn't really happen as the way most of us would have liked it. We're also thrilled to have with us Robert Motley. He's president of the board of directors of the National Association of Secondary School Principals, and most importantly, principal of Atholton High School in Columbia, Maryland for the past 14 years. So that's the lineup, and I'm going to go right now to John Rogers to fill us in on what he sees as the main findings of this very important national survey, which did have a focus also on California. So John, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody who's joined us this afternoon. As we remember all too well, the closure of school campuses in spring 2020 came with little warning, few resources, and minimal guidance from federal and state officials or professional organizations. Yet principals across the country leaned into this monumental task as health threats and economic dislocation affected staff, community members, and students. As one California principal reported, the transition to remote instruction will go down as one of public education's most incredible feats. My colleagues and I at UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access conducted a nationally representative survey with 344 public high school principals in late May and June to understand how schools took up this new role and how learning and student well-being have been affected by COVID-19. Our findings highlight public schools' heroic responses in supporting students and sustaining communities in difficult times. But they also point to the ways that long-standing inequalities and challenges to learning have been exacerbated, particularly in schools serving high-poverty communities. We take away 3 lessons for school leadership and educational policy. Lesson 1. The best public schools are community schools that connect families to health and social welfare services and foster social trust and understanding. Most principals reported that their school helps students and families access and navigate health services. Almost all delivered meals to students, and more than 2/3 said their school provided meals to family members of their students. Half provided support to students experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness. And sadly, 43% of principals reported providing support for students who experienced death in their families. In the months ahead, public schools should double down on strategies that support student well-being and strengthen relationships with various members of the community. As one principal told us, the connection between schools, students, and communities will be the key to not only getting back to normal, but coming back better than ever. Principals should conduct inventories of community needs, initiate conversations with community partners, and encourage teachers to engage students in curriculum that examines issues and concerns in their local communities. Lesson 2, provide learning opportunities for all students. Providing learning opportunities for all students requires that we address pre-existing and pervasive inequalities. Even as the global pandemic created a set of shared educational challenges, learning in some schools was more adversely affected than in others. For example, schools in middle-class communities were far more likely than schools serving high-poverty communities to have all staff equipped for remote instruction when they closed their doors. Principals also reported great variability in student access to the technology hardware and connectivity needed to participate from home. Middle-class schools were 3 times as likely as high-poverty schools to have almost all of their students ready for remote instruction at the time of transition. The pandemic has clarified what already was an emerging insight. Universal access to personal computing devices and broadband has become an essential precondition for learning in the 21st century, and access should be considered a fundamental right for all students. In addition, COVID-19 has brought into stark relief the impacts of economic distress on young people and on their learning. Too many students are experiencing food insecurity and unstable housing, and this makes it hard for young people to participate meaningfully in school. Principals in high-poverty schools were far more likely than their peers to report that large numbers of students were losing touch with schools amidst the strains of the pandemic. A principal in a high-poverty school noted, "My students' lives and well-being have become more and more precarious. There are some social safety nets, but not nearly enough, and the disparity is palpable. This principle's words underscore the need to enact broader social policies that ensure all young people secure food, stable housing, and ready access to healthcare. Lesson 3. Educators are anxious to get back to in-person learning, but many do not want to return to schools as they were. A Texas principal spoke for many of her colleagues when she said, "It's hard to go out into the hallways and not see any kids." Yet numerous principals told us that the COVID-19 crisis is an opportunity to reset, reflect on our values and beliefs, shift the way students are taught, or dismantle broken systems. A California principal explained, "Public education has not only changed during this pandemic, but it has caused us to prepare to see a new way of teaching our students forever." As we move forward, it will be important to nurture educators' desire to reimagine schooling and to do so in ways that center trusting relationships. Many states and districts have established elaborate rules about social distancing in order to ensure the safety of students and staff who return to school. In addition to providing sufficient physical space, educators need to foster creative space in which teachers, students, and community members can develop a shared vision for what schools should become. Let me close by noting that principals and educational policymakers are not the only ones learning lessons during this crisis. The most important educational lessons from COVID-19 are those that our students are learning every day as they observe their schooling and our political life. Lessons about equity, social trust, and the value that we place on young people's lives. The lessons students learn today will stay with them. What do we want these lessons to be? Thank you. I look forward to the conversation and hearing from the wonderful principals on our panel.
Thank you, John. And we're going to go to the principals now. I really want to hear from them and then circle back with you to get your reflections after they've presented their thoughts. So we are first going to go to Cynthia Gonzalez, who, as I mentioned, is principal of the School of Technology and Communications at the Diego Rivera Learning Complex. That's in LAUSD. And I just should mention also that Cynthia has a doctoral degree from UCLA, the Educational Leadership Program, also earned a master's degree and teaching credential from UCLA. Great tribute to her and to public education in California. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Please.
No, go ahead. I'll let you ask the question.
Okay. I just was wondering whether the findings of the survey, which John only presented a little piece of, aligned with your experiences and your views of what has happened and is happening.
I think it certainly has. I know it aligned definitely to what we saw at our school site. And there was power in seeing the graphs laid out. And I actually got really emotional when I kept going through all of the responses and always seeing certain communities left behind consistently in every measure, and to think that those are my students. And like, I get emotional now thinking about it, because that's the challenge we have at our sites as school leaders. It's never changed. I mean, our communities have always been left behind, and this pandemic just exacerbated that. And to just think in terms of like the inequity and the unfairness, and how our students were carrying the additional burden, I think for me, it does feel like a tremendous sense of responsibility to try to advocate for our students in whatever way that we can, both locally at our sites. And I know for me, it's been to really push some of the broader needs that are really like social needs and community needs that our students have, to policymakers and legislators and elected officials who have power to make some of these changes happen.
So I do have to ask you, you are a principal of the School of Technology and Communications. Could you just give us a thumbnail sketch of what that is. And then I want to ask you about the whole digital divide issue, because I'm just looking at the title of your school. This would suggest you had no problems. You have taken care of technology and communications.
You and me both. I thought the same thing. I was like, we are a technology school. We should be good to go. Our school is a one-to-one iPad school in the district. There's a few schools that have one-to-one programs. We were one of them. We've been a one-to-one iPad school for years. I mean, since I was a principal there, and this is my 6th year there. And so I made those assumptions that we would be fine because of that.
And one-to-one,
without knowing,
one-to-one means?
One-to-one iPad, student gets assigned an iPad that they keep for that school year. And pretty much it's assigned to them while they're at our school site. And so they have it to do work at school, and they also have it to do work at home. So for me, it was just a matter of figuring out maybe some that might not have been working as well. But what we realized is that students really tended to use their iPads mostly on our site with the assignments teachers were giving them on site. But once the students went home, there were a lot of issues with connectivity to Wi-Fi, either because students didn't have Wi-Fi, or there were issues syncing the district iPads to home internet or to the Wi-Fi hotspot students were given. And then the demands of learning online, the iPads didn't have the capacity to both have students on Zoom while opening multiple applications, while typing responses. I mean, it just became a broader issue, and that's something that we're still trying to resolve. So yes, I assumed we're a tech school using iPads. We felt like with our staff that we were lucky that our teachers had been using technology frequently, and so that wasn't new to them. But they were also not using it at the highest level of use. And so that's something that we've learned during this time, that we kind of have to step back and inventory with all of our students what isn't working. And there are a lot of things that aren't working right now that we need to address.
Can I just ask you then, because here we are mid-October, schools have been going for, well, almost 2 months. How are you doing on the technology front? And we recognize this is just one small piece of all the issues.
Yeah, it's just, yeah. So, I mean, what was interesting is when in the spring, when we went off, the teachers followed a very traditional mode of lesson planning. It was like do pages 1 through 10. It wasn't like virtual learning. It's just they were learning online, but they weren't creating like virtual lessons. Everything was very traditional. And so students we don't know if they would have been successful or not, because no student was allowed to fail. And so that impacted us being able to see concrete evidence of how they were doing. So this semester, our teachers spent the summer planning these really great modules with a lot of applications and tools. But we started realizing that those applications weren't working on our students' equipment. And we gave our own survey to students to find out what is happening. And most often than not, students were frustrated with the equipment being old, too slow, not functioning, the applications not working on the devices that we had. So we just recently had a conversation of having to go back to basics with our staff to give really basic assignments to students that are easy to complete. And we also found that half of our students are using their cell phone. Although they all have a district issued device, they're using their cell phone to do more of the work, to log into Zoom, both because it's easier, but it's also the Wi-Fi access is like ready. They don't have to try to connect or do anything else. And so that's something that we're trying to problem solve as well with students and purchasing additional Chromebooks. Although I've heard from other friends at schools that gave out Chromebooks that those are also not working out so well, because it's just the quality of them isn't that great. No offense to Microsoft, but I think those are all issues that we're still trying to solve. And I think as principals, we just have to be really adaptive and responsive to the things that we find on a daily basis.
Well, what you really underscored here is that how complex this issue is. It's not just getting devices to the student. It's not just getting the access. It's how the devices are working, how the students are accessing it, where they're accessing it. And you've just outlined like 10 different issues that we should be looking at EdSource in greater depth. But we're going to come back to you, Cynthia Gonzalez, but we're now going to Northern California to talk to Juan Manuel Raigosa, principal of Berkeley High School. And I should also, I just can't help mentioning that he too is a graduate of undergraduate, UCLA, and got teaching degrees from the Teacher Education Program and the Principal Leadership Institute at UCLA. Another, testimony to the incredible value of public education under threat right now because of the incredible budget problems that the university will be facing. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let me just ask you, you took over at Berkeley High just in the middle of this pandemic. You'd been there before, but what would you say has been and remains your biggest challenge as principal?
So thank you for having me here today. Yeah, I served as a vice principal at Berkeley High School for 3 years before this summer, and I stepped into the principal role when our former principal left. And I think the biggest challenge has been the challenge we've been facing since I got to Berkeley High and for years and years before, and that is that Berkeley High School historically has been an extremely diverse school in terms of ethnicity and economically, and with it has come great inequity that we know has existed, and so COVID has not shined a light that we knew this before, but it's intensified those inequities. So we have a lot of students who didn't have the resources before, and we weren't properly channeling the resources to them, and that's continued now. So I think the tech divide that Dr. Rogers spoke to has definitely come to the forefront now. And some of the same challenges that Cynthia Gonzalez mentioned is what we're experiencing now. We're not a one-to-one school, and so we had a lot of students who before the pandemic and now did not have access to the technology, the hardware and the software that we oftentimes ask our students to have in order to access the curriculum. And so we've made great strides, but we have a lot of work to do that. We do have a community in Berkeley that is well resourced and has given us the resources in order to be able to direct funds to that. So both to provide the Chromebooks and the software to students, but to speak to Dr. Rogers' other point about our students needing basic needs. I mean, we've done things now that we should have been doing before, and that's written checks so that families can have food on the table, written checks so that families can pay for rent, and so that they can at least have a roof over their head as we're asking them to engage in distance learning. So since mid-March, we have been 100% distance learning. Not a single student has stepped foot on campus since mid-March, and only a small number of teachers have decided to teach from the campus.
So let me just ask you, because I think people have certain perceptions of Berkeley, good and bad, I'd say, but it's an incredibly diverse community, and you have homeless kids and kids of professors, doctors, lawyers, all and extraordinarily diverse. As principal, how are you able to balance all those needs? And I imagine that every parent wants the best education for their kids, but within that, there are different needs. How do you balance that?
That's an extremely good question, because as a principal of Berkeley High, it is my job, and I have a large admin team who is there to serve all of our students, right? Whether it's a student that had all the technology before this pandemic and still has it now, or it's a student had none. I think we're unapologetic in our commitment to our students and our staff of color. I think we're unapologetic and move forward with a sense of urgency to serve our students who have historically been marginalized. And so that's exactly what we do. I think that, the fortunate thing is that at Berkeley High School, even before this pandemic, we have over 150 teachers who work at Berkeley High, and our professional development model focused on culturally relevant teaching. But going into this year, we wanted to be bold in the stance that we took, and so we're driven by looking at ourselves as anti-racist teachers. And so this year, for example, we're asking all of our teachers to reflect on their practice and to see themselves as policymakers and look at the policies that they enact in their classrooms, especially now with distance learning, what they expect with students, how they grade, how they assess students. And we're really asking them to no longer see themselves as being possible to be neutral, but rather enacting policies in their classrooms that either maintain the status quo and lead to racialized outcomes or disrupt that. So I think that we do try to serve all students, but our priority is always to address the students that are struggling the most.
Let me just ask you very quickly on just one issue around meals. I'm assuming you're doing the grab and go meals, or?
Absolutely. Our nutritional services department for the district is providing meals, and we also know that's not enough. We also know that we're setting up posts for families to be able to drive up to Berkeley High, to walk up to Berkeley High and pick up meals outside of the hours that we have. We're also going to different sites in the community that are closer to homes, for families that find it harder to maybe come all the way to Berkeley High School. And so we're finding different ways to get food into families' hands. We're also doing individual deliveries. If we know that a family's struggling, then we will get somebody to drive the food to them.
And just to clarify, because I think there's been an issue that the funding isn't there. The schools are picking up more than you getting reimbursed for the meals. How are you managing that? Because I think that's an issue for many districts.
Yeah, I think it's an issue. I think our district is still able to provide a meal per student, but then we're relying on the different fundraising committees that we have in the Berkeley community, and to allocate those funds to purchasing even more food. We're taking donations from families that can donate and creating bags of food that we can make available to families. We also we're working with our students. We have students and staff members who before this we're focusing on healthy eating and working with one of our small learning communities that cooks meals and provides that for families. So we're using all available resources.
Well, thank you for that. We'll circle back with you. We're going to go now to the East Coast and talk with Robert Motley, principal at Appleton High School in Columbia, Maryland, and president of the National Association of Secondary School Principals.
Well, thank you, Louis. I just wanted to, first and foremost, wish my colleagues on the panel happy National Principals Month. And believe it or not, I share in some of my colleagues' experiences at my own school. However, I'm here to kind of speak on a more national perspective. And as I interact with principals from all over the country, I've noticed that schools and communities have been able to rely on one particular constant, and that has been the principal's leadership. Back in March, when schools, suddenly closed, my colleagues quickly assessed what really mattered and redirected their energies to keeping kids and families stable. They reached out to them, helping both them and their teachers with the emergency shift to remote learning. Through all of the local and national political noise about reopening schools, principals maintained a focus on their families' needs. And my colleagues all across this country did an outstanding job leading their communities in the spring through this crisis. But now that the school year has started, what I can share with you is that we are losing large numbers of at-risk kids under this remote learning model. And I think the data that we've seen here this evening shows that. Schools are calling home, they're visiting homes. One is even considering taking out radio and TV ad spots to encourage kids to come back to school because they just can't locate some of them. However, if a principal stops in at a local McDonald's or a gas station, guess what? They see their kids working there. And that's out of necessity, it's not a choice. They're helping support their family. And that illustrates just why we need a comprehensive COVID relief package for both schools and to support families so we're not forcing kids to make tragic choices. It's worth taking a closer look at what Boston is doing. For example, they're mostly virtual, but they prioritize kids at risk for in-person instruction because those kids especially need the structure of oversight an in-person model provides. Now, as difficult as remote learning has been, we principals are at least able to still fill the role of instructional leader. We're working with teachers on curriculum and instruction. We're visiting virtual classrooms and providing feedback. When we switch from remote to hybrid or in person, the principal's role is going to change entirely to focus on COVID management, disinfecting tables and desks, enforcing mask policies and social distancing, etc. I call that COVID leadership. Under this model, instructional leadership really suffers as a result, and we're not able to do our best work, and that means that student learning is somewhat impacted. Teachers are exhausted. This pace that we're in right now is unsustainable, even in areas where things are going well. Principals are worried about the impact on teacher attrition. It's worrisome everywhere, but especially in states like Tennessee and Arizona, where the teacher pipeline is dry. And believe it or not, it's hard for us to talk about, but principals are exhausted as well. Districts quite rightly recognize that they must support teachers who are hurting in many ways. They might have lost a loved one, caring for small children or an aging parent, or just fearful for their own health. Many of my colleagues are hurting in the very same way, and they're overlooked for that support, but are expected to administer it. In an August survey by NASSP, 45% of principals said the pandemic is accelerating their plans to leave the principalship. If we see that come to fruition, we're going to have a leadership crisis on our hands in addition to a teacher crisis. So what is my message to my colleagues on this panel and principals across the country? Lean on your professional network. The greatest consolation is that we're all going through this together. So be intentional about breaking out of your isolation and connect with your colleagues. At its core, that's what organizations like NASSP are for. We've hosted town halls and webinars that allow for members to share ideas and support one another. We are so used to assuming that role as the strong, supportive leader, but we must also recognize that we need to take care of ourselves as well. We need our colleagues to keep up the pressure on Congress to pass a COVID relief bill. Every community has more significant needs than before, with less revenue than before as local economies struggle. There is no way schools will get through this without federal support. That will be true not just this year, but for the next several years until local economies recover. So we ask you to go onto our website and contact your members of Congress and let them know that they need your support. I want to thank you for allowing me to be a part of this discussion and to bring to light the impact across this country for principals vis-a-vis COVID-19.
Well,
Louis,
thank you so much. I did want to ask you, I think something which we are dealing with out here in some communities, which is the issue of homeless students. I don't know if that's an issue in your community, but how do you see schools dealing with that? And yeah.
Right, good question. And, you know, I happen to be, in John's survey, we're one of the low poverty schools. And so we are one-to-one. We had a very seamless transition to remote learning in my district and my school. And so it really wasn't an issue for us. But there are schools across this country that have homelessness as an issue, and really trying to find opportunities for students to re-engage. They've checked out. As I said earlier, we've lost kids. And so it's incumbent upon us to really work with schools to make sure that we provide, the resources, whether it be hotspots, social services, whatever they need to make sure that our students are being taken care of and their families as well. And I think that's the one thing that I think gets lost in all of this, is that we tend to focus, okay, how do we get these kids in school and get them learning? But it's more than that, right? Because there's that whole social unit. If their family's suffering, they're going to be suffering as well. So we've got to make sure the family's taken care of, and then we can deal with, educating the child as well.
One of the things we have seen is, I think the definition of homelessness, as you know, is kids who are living with other family members or with friends and so on. And that has become much more difficult for those who are fortunate enough to have those networks, because those houses, those family units have become much more crowded. And so it's kind of having a rippling effect. So,
Exactly.
well, thank you so much. I want to just circle back quickly to John Rogers to get any thoughts in response to these comments from the principals.
On something that Mr. Motley said, because it struck me as so important, and yet it poses a paradox of sorts. Mr. Motley was making the point that it's critically important to have an infusion of federal funds into states that would then flow into districts, that would flow into local public schools, so they can do this important work. And I think Mr. Motley is correct that principals have a unique voice that is trusted in the local community, that can speak out on these issues. And yet here's the paradox. As Mr. Motley was saying, principals are stretched beyond their capacity already right now. They're answering hundreds of emails a day. They're attending to all of the challenges of remote learning. And sometimes they have kids under tow because their own children are engaged in remote learning themselves. So my question to all of our panelists is it possible for principals to take on this public role, even as you are being strained in the ways you are? And do you have advice to us or to other principals on how principals can use their voices to articulate the needs that their schools and their communities have?
I mean, I could speak to some of that. I'm hearing feedback. There, it went away. So, I mean, even in thinking about the federal funds, how are we going to be able to use them? If I can use those dollars to buy MacBooks for my students that are like high quality and will do everything that they need to do, that's great. But if my students still don't have access to quality Wi-Fi, they're going to have a really great new laptop without access. And so that problem continues. So I feel like we have to do both, get money into schools, but also start getting our legislators to ensure that our students have access, that there's like broadband access for all of our schools and in all of our communities as an educational right, just like we would with textbooks, that students have a right to textbook in the state of California, that we view broadband access in that same light, not just for pre-K to 12, but into our higher educational system as well. And so to me, I feel like that's one of the pieces that I think is really important to add. I do feel that one of the ways we need to advocate is to try to push back on like business as usual practices that are continuing to happen, like continuing on with what we're asking principals to do as if it was a regular year in terms of their tasks and requirements and expectations, because it is not a regular year. I know we have to give here in California assessments to students, but we're giving all the assessments, like nothing is happening. And I feel like we have to be cognizant that we at the school site are struggling to just find where our students are. I spent half of my day today tracking seniors who are almost done, who have not attended not more than once to one of their sessions online. Calling them aren't working, you know, home visits are next because they just haven't shown up at all. And so we have all of that work to do. So I feel like part of what we can do is speak up and like with our leaders, our immediate supervisors, and this is the time to do it, because if we don't do it now, when are we going to speak up on behalf of our school sites, our own like well-being and mental health? I think that's like really, really important as well. And then in terms of managing the reopening, I mean, those are the conversations we're having now in our district, and we're being asked to set up each classroom, to set up all the labeling, signage, postage, while they're also asking us to work on the assessment calendar and roll out assessments to students who are not with us, while they're asking us to work on trying to bring students back for one-on-one tutoring, while they're asking us to, I mean, the list goes on and on. And I think we need to be creative with other personnel outside of our school that can come in and do some of that work for us. that's the management end of handling the COVID crisis and setting our schools up for success, while we handle the student end and the student academic success part of it. The more we can do that, and all we can do is participate in things like this, talk to our directors, ask questions at our meetings, bring up the issues more broadly so that people pay attention.
I did want to, I was going to save this question for last, but I want to make sure we get it in. I'm going to just pose this to the panelists without wanting to sugarcoat or diminish the the seriousness of the crisis we're in. I mean, one of the things that I think wanted to ask you whether you see any opportunities for reinvention, any things that you are seeing that you could learn from that would help contribute to rethinking how we do things once this pandemic is over, because it will be over. It's hard when we're in the middle of it. I will just say one thing that's positive that has emerged from this whole crisis is a recognition of the value of schools and the role that schools play, not only in education, but in the mental and health and all the needs of kids. And now people are always, well, somebody else needs to take care of this. Now schools are supposed to take care of it, but it is affirming the value of schools. But I'd just like to go through the panel. I'll start with Mr. Regossa. Do you see any things that you say, wow, this is something we can really use for the positively going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to a point that Dr. Rogers, mentioned from the survey about principals saying that we don't want to go back to normal. I think we can't go back to normal because normal in schools wasn't working, right? It was never working for a large number of our students. And so I think there are a couple things that we've put in place now that I would really advocate that we keep. And so a couple examples of that are just like we have a renewed value for schools in our society, we have a renewed value for what it means to engage and to build relationships with our parents and our guardians, right? We would always say that we value them, and now they're at home with our kids as our kids are doing their best to learn. And so how do we value them, and how do we respect them, and how do we bring them to the decision making in genuine ways and in real ways? And so we're finding ways to do that now. I think also, something at Berkeley High we were able to do after negotiations is bring some of the structures for support for students from an afterthought into the school day. Right, so we built in at Berkeley High now a time for our teachers to spend and dedicate to parent engagement and calling homes and emailing homes into the school day. So rather than saying that's something that you need to do after you're done with the school day, and we know what that means, right? Something we've also done is just our schedule has allowed us now to not just have our traditional 6 classes a day for 5 days a week, or rather in the middle of the week, we have small group support, right? So we have targeted interventions for kids, and we bring them into small cohort settings and provide additional supplemental support. And that's something that, again, before was just an afterthought. It happened after school, right? If you need additional support, come see me after the entire school day is done. And we value that by saying that's a required part of our educational program. And so those are some of the things that we've done. I think this work is not sustainable, and we got into it because there is a sense of urgency around supporting our students, right? And so I think that the only advice I could say is this isn't a time to ask anybody to do more, right? It's a time to be compassionate and to work with grace, and to meet everybody's basic needs, both students and staff. I think Mr. Motley brought up a good point. I think this is an opportunity to again ask our federal government to consider what we do about leaves, right? Especially when women of color across the country are affected disproportionately, right? We've had staff members who have had to leave work and go on leaves because they have to take care of their children. And that's just not okay. It's never okay. And so putting pressure on our federal government, on our state governments, and just planning carefully. You know, at Berkeley High, we've definitely made sure, and I would continue to pressure everybody to listen to the experts, the epidemiologists, the public health experts in the city of Berkeley, and the local counties, and follow their lead of when it's safe to come back, because there's a tremendous pressure to bring our students back. And we just can't do that and risk our students' lives.
Well, thank you. Wow, there's some really key points in there. I'm going to go to Mr. Motley and then go to Dr. Gonzalez about anything.
Sure. Yeah. So
learning here that could help us going forward.
on a personal note from my own school, right? So we're a high performing school. I've got, 11 National Merit semifinalists, 30 commended, students for National Merit. So, and my staff has always been very content focused. We've got to do this. And so what has come out of this, especially at the start of a new school year, is that we really challenged them and asked them, we need you to build community. Some of these kids you don't know that are coming into your classes this year. And so I need you to concentrate a little bit more on getting to know your students. That is the key. And not to say they never did that before, but in a different way now. We're virtual. So how does that look, getting to know your students? And what does that look like? And so we spent the first 2 weeks of school doing that. Kids showing their pets and talking about, it was a really great. Parents sent me emails going, my kid's so excited now. He wants to come and talk about, his things in class with his teacher that he's never done before. And it was a wonderful way. And that's just a personal from us. National-wide, I think that it's forced teachers to think about how to do things differently. They've got this virtual environment, and so you can't just pull out your lesson plan and do the same thing you've done always that you've done. And so really reinventing the way that you deliver instruction and how that looks. And then just on a side note that we joke about here in Maryland, where we still have snow days, but we won't have snow days anymore because everyone's has a device now, and we can actually work from home when there's inclement weather. So that's another positive on that end, that we don't have to build those snow days into our calendar. So I think we won't go back to where we were. I think we have there is a current evolution taking place that we will come out of this looking different. Our whole education environment will look different.
Dr. Gonzalez, a quick thought. I'm watching the time to try to get in a few more questions. But
yeah, I agree with Mr. Raigosa and Motley around the relationships. That's one thing our school was really good at, our relationships, and where other schools started to implement an advisory curriculum. We've always had that as a core of our school. And so that is the one class where other schools struggling with students attending that class. That is where our students do attend. That is where they are doing all of their assignments, and they're all about relationship building with our teachers. And I think maintaining that for all of our students, I think all of our students deserve to have that, right? And so I think that's really positive. I would venture to say how we look at attendance. I would want us to change in how we see that, because right now, I have students who started working full time, and during this virtual learning space, we've been able to say, okay, but make sure you do your work. So they're doing their work, because right now they're working, like they're having to sustain their families. And so, to me, the way we've tracked attendance here in our state is it's connected to our funding. It wasn't always that way. And I feel that if there's ways that we can change that, especially in light of this, so that students don't feel that their only choice is to drop out. Because I've had that conversation with my staff where I'm like, what do we do when we come back? They need to change their job schedule. And they're like, well, do you want us to tell them to drop out? And I'm like, no, I don't want them dropping out. If they're doing the work at night, like, I don't want them dropping out. But I know that the way the system's set up, that students gonna have to make that choice, right? Survival or going back to school. And so to me, I hope that like at the state level, we could change some of how we look at attendance, how we fund our schools, and also just getting our teachers online, because before this, there were still teachers who had never really taught using compute. You know what I mean? I know it seems far-fetched, but who weren't comfortable with being online. And this kind of has forced everybody to really use technology. And I feel like that's going to propel us into a stronger future. We do it wisely and we have the infrastructure in place.
Louis, if I could just say, I can't hold back with this, and this is, why I got into the national level. We have a presidential election going on right now, and yet education is not part of the discussion and the debate, it's a travesty, especially given what schools are going through right now. And so it's incumbent upon us to make it part of the discussion and debate. And I think that, we have to be loud and vigilant about making sure that people understand what we're going through, what we need to be successful. So I'm sorry, I just had to say that.
Well, yes, we're at a moment of historic importance, to say the least. So thank you for that. John, did you want to get in a quick word on the reinvention? Did you pick up anything in terms of the survey that you see as key?
I want to echo something that each of the panelists have spoken to some extent, and that's the importance of human relationships. We are talking at a moment in which we are also celebrating the 50th anniversary of a very classic book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in which Paulo Freire lifted up for us all that education at its core is about human dialogue, in which through that dialogue, we each become more fully human. For that to occur, we need to have conditions outside of school that ensure decent housing, secure food. We need to have healthcare for everyone. And then inside of school, we need to build relationships of trust and understanding and mutuality. My colleague, Dave Silval at University of Chicago, Illinois, recently said, we need to think about schools that are the dreams of our dreams. We're at a moment of great difficulty, but we're also at a moment where we can reset and think about the schools that are the dreams of our dreams. And we need to move forward with that agenda right now.
I want to just thank you, John, to get a question from, it was submitted. We've noticed, this is the question, we've noticed with our students that the distance learning school day doesn't allow for student collaborations, peer-to-peer study, help, and social relationships. Maybe it's piggybacking on what you were saying, John. Any ideas on how to create community, quote unquote, in a distance learning environment? I think we're going to get one of you to answer. So any one of the panelists who has thoughts on that?
We have built into our schedule every Monday, 45-minute, we call that our club and activities, virtual club and activities time. So that just because we're virtual doesn't mean that we still can't meet, our clubs and activities still can't meet. Just because we're not having athletics doesn't mean that the team can't still get together and talk about sports or something. And so every Monday that's built into our schedule that we allow for our school community. We are the Atholton Raiders, and so we call it Raider time. And so they all come together during that Monday and they sign up. There's a sign up that they go to, and they get to interact with their peers in that social, however they want to. That's when, like I said, all of our clubs and everything meets.
Anybody else have a quick thought on that? This seems so key. I mean, in terms of kids wanting to be with other kids, and that's so much what school is about, is connecting with other kids.
We work with a partner organization. We've been working with them for like 4 years now, where we have what we call ACE days, and they're full days that are just around community building. Obviously, we're modifying that because of the virtual world. We're only doing about an hour and a half. That's time when we have teachers work with students and really getting to know each other with really deep, meaningful questions about values, and that's where teachers get to know the lives of the students, and the teachers participate also and share. So that's where we get that sense of like relationship and family at our school. starting with our incoming ninth graders, which we have never met. And I think that's why they're struggling so much right now, to hopefully with the students who join on those sessions can start building that relationship virtually, and prepare us so when they do come back, they already know each other in meaningful ways.
Wanted to get out, we can't have this discussion without talking about learning loss. Probably the biggest concern here throughout this whole crisis. Any ideas as to how, in California in particular, policymakers can help with this? Mr. Regossa, you want to? To what extent are you seeing that? To what extent are you concerned, and what do you need to help you deal with that?
I mean, absolutely. I think it's something I've been thinking about since March, right? When we abruptly from one day to the next just had to close down, and nothing has been the same since. And I also want to take a very careful approach to this topic because oftentimes when I'm holding conversations with people around learning loss, we're really looking at some arbitrary line of where students should be by June, or what they should know by the time they graduate high school in math or in English or in history. And we're living in a pandemic where the lives of our students matter. And so it's okay to not get to where we were before, to not cover the standards that we were supposed to cover before, to not get to that assessment. And so I really focus on the social emotional learning, the social emotional growth. Going back to the previous question, I think the mental health of our kids is absolutely critical. And so building community and giving our teachers the time and the space to look at their curriculum and to truly now focus on essential standards, what is most essential for them to know. And to know that whenever we do return to school, whenever this pandemic is over, there is going to be a lot of reteaching. There's gonna be a lot of understanding that students are missing some key skills.
Well,
on the other end of that spectrum, just to give you a different perspective that you may not hear, I think I mentioned to you how I have a pretty high performing school. And so some of my parents they're those helicopter parents, and they're really concerned about this loss. And so what they've done is they've actually enrolled in our dual enrollment program and are taking courses at the community college to make sure their kids are prepared and ready to go on. And so that's how they're handling that perception that there's going to be that loss, because we've done a really good job in revamping our curriculum to make sure it doesn't happen, but there is that perception out there, and that's how our parents are deciding to deal with it.
I'll just mention quickly, and then we're going to go to John Rogers for closing comments. Thank you for all the questions you submitted. We tried to get to as many as we could. EdSource did a survey from parents as to what they saw as the major challenges in distance learning. Most of them, the biggest challenge was, as far as they were concerned, was how to keep kids interested, how to keep them motivated. And as to several of you made this point, I think this is this could lead to some real innovation, and the teachers and all of the whole education community really rethinking how do we motivate kids. And that, of course, if we can figure out how to do this during a pandemic, this would be invaluable going forward. So, John Rogers, any closing thoughts?
Say that the key to motivation in the past few decades has been provide space for young people to come together and to be in social relationships with one another. We don't have that right now. And so we're being pressed in ways that we haven't been before. We need to think about making our classrooms spaces where young people feel empowered and feel that they are there for a reason and a purpose. And I also just want to note that the principals we heard from today are reflective of principals all across the country and teachers all across the country who are every day making extraordinary efforts to deal with this pandemic and make the lives of their students and their communities as sustainable as possible. We need to support them. We need to create a better future through partnership with them. Thank you.
Well, I know that we've just scratched the surface, but I've been moved by this discussion, elevating the role of principals, the importance of principals, and we didn't even get to the stress that I'm sure each of you are feeling. And you all seem very relaxed, I have to say. So maybe it's just the end of the school day. So, but that was reassuring. I just did want to mention, for those of you who haven't signed up for EdSource's daily newsletter, which will bring you reports on podcasts and so on the work of John Rogers and others at UCLA and elsewhere, and the work that's being done throughout California, please sign up on our website at edsource.org. And I want to just thank you at UCLA and all the panelists, and to keep on supporting principals as they try to lead us through these extraordinarily difficult times. Thanks again, and good afternoon.